Hello, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. We're just dealing with some tech issues at the back end, but we should get them all sorted. We're just going to give it another minute before we kick off. Thanks. There we are. We've got three of our four speakers, and I think the fourth is going to join in just a moment. So we might kick off. So hello and welcome to this Asia Foundation run event, Navigating Crisis with Insight, Why the Future of Development Cooperation Needs Political Economy Analysis. My name is Lisa Denny. I'm the Director of the Centre for Human Security and Social Change at La Trobe University and have the pleasure of working regularly with the Asia Foundation on political economy analysis. I'm joining you from Melbourne, Australia, and so I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live. That's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I also pay my respects to any other Indigenous persons who are joining us today. For those of you who are outside of Australia and who might be unfamiliar with acknowledgements of country as a way of opening proceedings, this is actually a great example of trying to be more explicit about an element of Australia's political economy, acknowledging the history of dispossession and exclusion that's happened here, and building greater awareness and respect for Indigenous knowledges that are regularly overlooked. So I have been looking forward to chairing today's discussion and hearing from our excellent lineup of speakers on an issue close to my heart, the future of political economy analysis and what it has to offer in this particular political moment that might be characterised by crisis more than stasis. So as we all know, international development and the aid system is undergoing a period of significant change forced upon it by aid cuts, the abrupt dismantling of US aid, and also by long-standing critiques of aid. And I think it remains to be seen whether that period of change is going to result in sort of more surface level rebranding and reforms, or whether we're seeing a more wholesale transformation underway. But this moment of change is seeing a range of alternative approaches being put forward, including this idea of radical simplification. So the idea that we should focus on a few highly cost-effective interventions and do them at large scale in multiple countries. There's also a much more strident use of aid in the national interest. Now, of course, that's nothing terribly new, but I think at the moment we're seeing that happen in a much more unabashed way. And that risks potentially seeing more transactional and short-term approaches to aid. So in an environment of simplified multi-country aid potentially and more short-termist and transactional thinking, there's a risk that political economy analysis comes to be seen as an unnecessary add-on to development assistance. And that's despite the fact that it has emerged, of course, to ensure more effective development assistance through being more locally led, more contextually grounded, and more politically aware. There are also questions about the utility of PEA in navigating moments of crisis. So often when we think about PEA, it's a form of analysis that is focused on understanding the status quo, on unpacking why stasis persists. But in a global moment where crisis seems to be increasingly the name of the game rather than the status quo, we also want to think in this session about how PEA is a tool for navigating flux and crisis. So I'm going to turn to our panel and introduce the four speakers that we have who are expertly placed to assist with that. The first speaker, Kirsten Bishop, is the Assistant Secretary, Development Performance and Advisory Services Branch in the Australian Government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Kirsten has worked for DFAT, previously AusAid, since 2001 in a range of development policy and program management roles. She served as Counsellor, Poverty and Social Development, and Minister Counsellor, Governance and Human Development at the Australian Embassy in Jakarta. And she's also previously worked in Papua New Guinea and on issues of governance, fragility, law and justice, including for 2 years on secondment to the Asia Foundation in Bangkok as Regional Director of Law and Justice. And we just had some audio challenges getting Kirsten in the room. So Kirsten, just wanted to check if you are now here with us and can use your audio. Perhaps not quite yet. All right, let me introduce the other speakers, and we'll come back to, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now
We can hear you. That's great. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Duncan Green, who is a professor in practice and international development at the London School of Economics and director of the LSE Activism, Influence and Change program. He's the author of How Change Happens and From Poverty to Power, How Active Citizens and Effective States Can Change the World. And from 2004 to 2024, he was Senior Strategic Advisor at Oxfam GB, where he ran the From Poverty to Power blog. Our third speaker is Gopa Tampi, who is an independent governance expert. Over the last 30 years, he's served as a consultant and governance advisor across Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe, focusing on issues of governance reform, accountability, and capacity building. He was instrumental in setting up the global and South Asia hubs of the Affiliated Network for Social Accountability and is the former head of the Asia Desk at the Transparency International Secretariat and the executive director of the Public Affairs Centre in Bangalore. And our final speaker is Dr. Nicola Nixon, who is the Senior Director of Governance at the Asia Foundation, where she leads the Foundation's governance portfolio, including research and programs in subnational governance, public sector reform, and law and justice. I'm going to start by asking a couple of rounds of questions to our panel. Audience members, you're most welcome to add any questions that you have to the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll make sure that we have some time at the end to come to those. The event is set to end on the hour, but we'll see how we go, and we may run over just a little if that means that we can get to more of your questions. So please stick around if you don't have to run off immediately. Okay, let me turn to our panelists, and Duncan, I might start with you. I wanted to ask what you would see as some of the main criticisms of political economy analysis in development assistance to date, and what role you see PEA potentially playing within a wider transformation of aid.
Thanks, Lisa. So I suppose I was tracking back through From Poverty to Power old posts, and there's a great post by Heather Marquette at the University of Birmingham saying, what's the difference between all these phrases we bandy about, like thinking, working politically, PDIA for the nerds on the call, political economy analysis, and she had this great definition of political economy analysis as how to get from political won't to political will. Which is about the only useful way of thinking about the phrase political will that I've come across. And crucially, not F things up. So that she thinks those are the two uses of PEA. But I think there's a lot of problems with PEA, I have to say. I hate the phrase. It's why does economy get in there? It's really annoying that economy thinks it has the right, economists and economists think they have the right to be in every conversation. Often it's actually just about politics. So it's like you have to do this window dressing to make it acceptable. I think it's the fact that it's political economy analysis just means it's basically just analysis, and that immediately brings to mind analysis paralysis, lots of documents, and it's language from outside. It's language which the PA community is urging on donors and outsiders, saying, hey, look, these places where you're working, they're just like your own country. They have power, they have politics, they have histories. You need to look at that and what it's turned into. Whereas if you're working with local staff, it's like, duh, obviously, we need to understand how things work here. Otherwise, we're not going to get any results. So it betrays a kind of outsider mentality. And it generates huge amounts of work for consultants, which obviously I'm not opposed to in principle, but it does tend to lead to big documents which sit on shelves, and very good work for the consultants who write them. They can often cut and paste one from one PA to another PA, which is very efficient and lucrative. And it's just like it's become an industry. Now, I should say I love PEA. I perhaps didn't sound like that, but I think it needs to be a different thing. It needs to get closer to thinking and working politically. It needs to move from documents to more like the rules of thumb that you need, the kind of heuristics, the instincts you need to work in complex, messy situations where you have to have a deep knowledge of the place you're working in. And if you don't have that deep knowledge, you have to work with people who do and respect them. So I think there's a big link between rethinking PEA and the whole conversation about localization. And I think if we're serious about PEA, and I'll stop here, we have to be serious about the systems in the aid sector that either enable or block PEA. It's no good having a great document if you're then got a massive pressure to, your burn rate has to be up to scratch. You can't afford to wait and think and talk to people. You've got to get money out the door before the end of the financial year. Oh, and by the way, there's huge amounts of compliance because we're really terrified that any of this money might end up in the hands of the wrong people. So don't trust locals anyway. I mean, there are so many contradictions, which we all know within the aid sector, and PEA and the sort of abuse of PEA plays into that. And if we want to get PEA right, it has to come along with those other reforms, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And actually picking up on that point about systems in the aid sector, I mean, Kirsten, I wanted to bring you here, and this might play into one of the concerns Duncan's raised. But there seems to be much more focus in donor agencies on risk, including as part of efforts to shift more towards locally led development. And I wondered if you could speak to how PEA is being used to help DFAT manage risk or uncertainty.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And just double checking that you can hear me.
Yes,
great.
We can hear you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa, and hi, everybody on the call, on the line. Yeah, so absolutely, I think the focus in DFAT on risk is central, as I think it is in most organisations involved in trying to design and deliver or undertake risky activities. And we can see that, as you mentioned, playing out in sort of one of the sort of policy focuses or the ways of working that DFAT is trying to support, which is locally led development. When within DFAT, I think the way we are trying to position or think about the utility or the use of political economy analysis in all its forms, so not just the sort of the big documents that Duncan has warned us against, but also thinking that the way we think about political economy analysis as a discipline, a framework, a way of thinking that we staff can use, our colleagues can use to help them understand risk, in fact. So you can think of political economy analysis as a tool for understanding the risks involved or the risk environment in which you might be working, whether it's on a sort of at a country level or regional level, but right down to the very local or sectoral or issue level. So in that sense, I think, the work that we've been doing in this organisation, but, the efforts everywhere to sort of think about how we can use political economy analysis and make it useful for staff is a really core element in strengthening how we understand risk and what we do about it in terms of strategy development, design processes, and risk mitigation or, risk frameworks, making sure that they are realistic, that our assumptions are solid and deep, or based on evidence, or that we're not making assumptions that are not well founded by an understanding of how change happens in a particular context. So I think when you see that in the context of locally led development, one of the things that we in DFAT have tried to do in the way we've provided guidance to our staff in thinking about how do we support locally led development, we see supporting locally led development as a kind of iteration or a next iteration of the work that we've been doing for years on trying to working politically in development, trying to take a more politically informed approach to our development cooperation approach. We recognise that developmental change is a political process. So then we need to, if we're trying to influence that as an outside actor, we need to understand how that works and what are the risks involved. By helping us understand that, we can understand the risks and manage and make better decisions, better informed decisions about who and how we can support locally led developmental change. So I think in summary, it's just really it's intrinsic to a really strong supporting capability for us in being able to effectively support locally led development in a way that's going to have the biggest, hopefully, chance of having a good impact, but also while managing the range of risks that we, particularly as a external government actor, that we need to make sure we're managing.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. And I'd like to loop back to this risk point maybe a bit later on. But Gopra, I wanted to bring you in and thinking in particular about your work in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, to ask how you found PEA helpful in navigating moments of crisis as opposed to moments of stasis.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Hope you can hear me well.
We can hear you well.
Okay, thank you. Greetings to everybody. Let me start by saying that I'm often warned and ridiculed for conducting political economy analysis in Sri Lanka, which people say would make astrology look good. Because the situation is so dynamic that you can't be certain with anything. But given the hindsight of working in a politically fractured and contested space for over 2 decades, one can say with some level of confidence and humility that honing and developing political insight and political intelligence, and also developing the sensibility to use it strategically, has given a lot of critical value to programming in a constantly changing context. I share some of the disquiet which Duncan shared with the framing of PEA, as we know it in some sense coming heavy with templates and toolkits. That is why I reduce my ambition to say political intelligence and the sensibility to use that intelligence in proactive ways. So in both crises, so we have, if you look at the last 20 years, Sri Lanka is perhaps the best exemplar of how many crises can a system take. So in moments of crisis, we have felt that political economy readings and political context readings have been extremely essential in understanding who really held power, what alliances shifted, and where resistance and opportunities emerged. I think to counter any proposition that PEA is a static tool, our journey reflects that it's often crisis which forced PEA, trying, for example, shifting from elite diagnosis to mid-level bureaucracy and local level, dynamics. Ironically, though, PEA or the readings have been much more valuable during periods of apparent stability. A classic example is the digitization reforms that we often quote, which created a sense of an aesthetic progress or reforms, but it sort of masked political regressions and backlashes which are slowly developing. So without having the proper tools and analytical frames, we would have never been able to anticipate in times of seeming quiet or calmness what is brewing underneath the waters. So it has been kind of both helpful both during crisis and stasis. But I think it is important from our reading to highlight that PEA was never about kind of crisis reading. It is more about unpacking the relational ecosystem behind the formal architecture. For example, our readings, our analysis helped us to reframe the question from what can be implemented to what relationships can be leveraged to unlock change. So I think it is this relational element of PEA, because in contexts like Sri Lanka, the real levers of change lie in trust, discretion, moral legitimacy, and informal alliances, not much on the stakeholder mapping that you do at a higher level. So I would kind of end by saying that the practice, the culture of doing constant political context analysis, building that intelligence, and kind of experimenting with when to use it sensibly, has allowed to sense resistance, anticipate backlash, and more important, cloak reforms in ambiguity when needed, and reemerge when windows reopen. So this has been a compass to navigate in crisis and a lens to interpret in times of stasis. I'll sort of end here and hand it back to you.
Thanks, Gopa. And yeah, we might come back to you later to hear a bit more about how you do that. But Nicola, just building on from that, are there other examples that you've observed within TAF where PEA is a useful crisis navigation tool, again, as opposed to sort of understanding stasis?
Thanks, Lisa. And yes, hello, everyone. And thanks very much for joining us today. Just since we're talking about crisis, I did just briefly want to mention that our thoughts are very much with our colleagues in Nepal today, who are in the midst of a very intense crisis right now, and that just wanted to let them know that we're all thinking of them. And there's actually several examples from our work in Nepal that I could have been talking about today. So I think this is I think this angle on PEA, thinking about it in terms of response to crisis, is actually really helpful. Because I know I too have spent quite a lot of time, like you said at the start, Lisa, thinking about how PEA is really helpful for understanding the status quo, responding to that question of why things don't change, why things get so stuck, rather than helping us when things kind of shift quickly. But actually, we see lots of examples, because we do see some significant crises in several of the countries that we're working in, where it's actually useful in that way. And it reminds us, I think, also that if it's treated as a research product, then in a crisis it arrives too late. It has to be embedded in a team in the way that the team and the partners work, so that there's a shared language and shared concepts. We have a good example from our work in Bangladesh. Now, that's another country that's just been through huge political upheaval over the last year or so, since mid-2024, when the student uprising ended the Awami League government. And there's now this interim government, which is stable but relatively unstable until elections happen next February. And one really critical issue that's been in the mix of all of that has been the role of the media. Long suppressed by the previous regime, but also central in shaping public debate and accountability. And our governance team there has been really agile at using PEA in daily practice to help that sector, because they've been working in the media sector for quite some time. They've got embedded long-term relationships. To be thinking beyond the change of formal institutions, to be thinking beyond just the updating of, say, the 1974 Press Council Act, which is where they had been heading, and to focus instead on where power really sits, with bureaucrats, with media owners and political figures. And this has allowed the team, through sort of regular, PEA analysis, it's like discussions, basically, really well-structured discussions, to seize a window of opportunity and work with coalition partners to push forward on politically feasible reforms, things like self-regulation and grievance handling. And this has helped reform policy proposals to reassure nervous bureaucrats, to address media owners' concerns about the financing of reform, and to keep adapting through scenario planning as politics have shifted. So it really shifted the focus for a lot of the stakeholders to thinking about the informal norms that shape the media behaviour: self-censorship, partisanship, patronage, clientelism, concentrated ownership, even sort of patriarchal dimensions of newsroom cultures, and how trying to tackle those informal dynamics are as critical as the formal legal reforms. So that's, to me, they're a really great example of how they work through a PEA lens, in the way that Gopa was describing our Sri Lanka office does as well, to really work in a more agile way, and also sharing that and engaging on that with their partners and partner organisations to excellent effect. So I think that's a really good example. Back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, and I guess in this sort of, sorry. Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure if I cut somebody off. In the next set of questions, I wanted to shift more, I guess, towards the operational, thinking about what we can practically do to take PEA forward. And Duncan, I wanted to loop back to that idea of risk that Kirsten was speaking about earlier, and wanted to ask you about what you see as the challenges of treating treating PEA as a risk management tool. And more broadly, I guess, what obstacles you think donors and programs face in actually operating in political economy informed ways.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Great comments from everybody. Thanks. I'm getting a blog here. I'm always happy when I'm getting a blog. So I guess when I'm thinking about why something doesn't happen, why a good idea is not being followed, I usually just have a rule of thumb, which is what's the combination of ideas, interests, and institutions which is stopping it. I'll explain what that means, because it's a bit jargony. But so in terms of the ideas that block progress on PEA, I think one is that the aid sector is often characterized by disciplines at war. Sometimes we call them silos. So, are you a governance person? Are you a health person? Are you an education person? Each of those disciplines prizes its technical skill and understanding. And that sometimes gets in the way of actually thinking about those informal relationships that Gopher and Nicola talked about, the political obstacles to what you're trying to do. You've got a perfect plan. You just need to get people to institute it in your area. So I think there's a problem there about the technocratic and the disciplinary based way aid is designed versus having this, PEA is essentially interdisciplinary. I guess you could call it that. It's saying, we're going to embrace uncertainty, embrace messiness, and try and understand where power lies in different parts of the system and how it can be operated. In terms of that's ideas, in terms of interests, as I mentioned earlier, I think the interests within the aid sector are, you got to shift the money in your financial year. You've got to not screw up, or if you do screw up in the same way as everybody else, as Keynes once said, not screw up differently, because that brings attention to you. And it means that the power is in the wrong place. That sort of approach, those interests actually mitigate against real deep localization, really prizing local knowledge, because constantly you've got this person flying in who's got to shift a load of money within the next 3 months and hasn't got much time to go and sort of sit at the feet of local academics or local think tanks and try and really understand what's going on. That's a caricature, but there is that element, I think, still within the aid business. And then in terms of institutions, as lots of people have mentioned, the whole sort of compliance framework, I like the idea that you can flip risk into a way of making PEA a positive, but the other side of risk is to avoid risk rather than manage it. And I've seen much more examples of trying to make risk zero than make risk an optimal level. And then in a zero risk environment, then you actually don't do the kind of things that PEA would suggest. And the power imbalances in the institutions mean that you're it's just colonial. You're blind to the point of view of the other. You're trying to really put yourselves in the shoes and the positions of the people you're trying to influence and understand what forces operate upon them, and then see how you align. As long as you have all this money that you have to spend by the end of the financial year, it's very hard to do that. So I think there are some real institutional barriers. If we can link PEA to another 3-letter acronym, VFM, value for money, then I think that opens a lot of doors. And I don't think we've got, maybe I just haven't read it. I don't think we've got the killer research, the killer examples that show here's a thing where somebody tried non-PEA and it went really badly, so they flipped PEA and suddenly, wow, it was incredibly successful. Or a comparison between PEA, non-PEA programs, and getting it out of the governance and anti-corruption ghetto into the big money tickets in the aid sector, like health and education and infrastructure. There's so much where we need to demonstrate value for money, and then doors should open. There'll still be obstacles, as I outlined.
Thanks, Duncan. Kirsten, I'm going to come back to you, and you might want to reply to some of Duncan's comments. But I wanted to ask you, in the sort of beyond aid world and in an integrated foreign affairs department like DFAT, do you find PEA can be a helpful bridge between aid, trade, diplomacy, or does it really remain staunchly a development tool?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Duncan, for those points as well. I guess because it's made me reacting all the way along to what you were saying, because I think from the perspective of a DFAT person in the Australian government, I mean, as you mentioned, Lisa, we are in an integrated development cooperation program is managed primarily from within DFAT. And I think, we very much feel like we are already in a beyond aid world. The way that, development cooperation is positioned or thought about within the Australian government, and you can see it in our sort of policy statements, is that it's very much anchored as a tool, people, we've referred to the term tool of statecraft, but basically a set of institutions, a way of operating that supports the bilateral and regional relationships and partnerships that the Australian government has, alongside development cooperation, the official development assistance, which has its whole set of institutions, ideas, incentives that Duncan is talking about. It's one suite or one kind of tool that we have at our disposal as a government, but with that, it sits alongside the other tools of statecraft that the Australian government has, like any country, which is to do with broader, whether it's trade, economic interactions, migration, security. So we very much think about the way we, how does the Australian government want to deploy or use development cooperation, the institutions that sit around that, to support change in the region. And it's very much anchored in this notion of partnership. And this is, I guess, trying to get at some of the concerns that Duncan and others have raised, where, you know, where is the power balance? You know, the way our development assistance at the very strategic level is positioned is as I mentioned, it's anchored by a whole range of broader institutional agreements, arrangements, relationships that we have, and it looks very different, you know, and it's the same around the world. You know, if you looked at any particular country, the nature of the relationship between a particular country and another is fundamentally what then out of that then comes a sort of, that's the grand scale political economy sort of dynamic that we have to understand as an external actor, Australia, in our relationships with a particular country. We then have to kind of cascade down and think about and provide advice to our government, our ministers and decision makers in our department about, based on our understanding of how change is happening and what we've agreed or what our government is asking us to achieve, which tool of statecraft is going to enable us to support that change process and why? What are the risks involved and how do we mitigate them? And so you'll see then all of that sort of higher level decision making then it finally flows down into the tool of statecraft that is development cooperation. And then we get more granular in terms of saying, okay, well, we're going to use, you know, we think this is an effective way to support change. How do we go about doing that? So getting to your question, this is something that is done and involves everyone in the department. And I think what's interesting, you know, there are certain people who are focusing on more one tool of statecraft at any one time compared to another. So, and that changes over a person's career. But the way we are encouraged to think about from the policy level down right through to implementation is how these different ways of working link together. And it's based on a kind of a strategic political economy analysis that says, helps us to try and understand where do we have the best chance of having the kind of impact that we want, and that we have agreed with our country, bilateral and regional partners, in a way that enables us to manage risk. And that essentially is value for money. Duncan, coming to your point, if we're spending public money, which we are in the case of official development assistance, well, all of the money that the government spends, we have to, it's a requirement for the Australian government, we have to demonstrate value for money. It's a legislative, you know, instead of institutions that we have to respond to. So absolutely, I mean, I agree with you, Duncan, that I feel that the way we're thinking about political economy analysis and how our staff can use it is to help us do a better job and get that walk that line of getting the impact, but also managing the risk and therefore getting the value out of the taxpayers' money that we're spending. Thanks.
That's nice. Thanks, Kirsten. That's a nice segue to bring you back in, Gopa, around how we actually do PEA in ways that then can help deliver the outcomes you're speaking about, Kirsten. So, you know, PEA is obviously undertaken in a range of ways, and I think they're probably becoming more diverse from your sort of expert-led report to much more team collaborative exercises. I wondered, in your experience, how have you found PEA is most effectively undertaken and why? Thank
you, Lisa. So there are 2 points I wanted to highlight. So we began by doing the expert-led macro diagnostics, you know, just give a broad shot of, and that is very critical in Sri Lanka, given when a country like Sri Lanka, where the national narrative is very, very dominant and kind of has a huge influence on local politics. So you need to map that national narrative well. But what we discovered along the way is that this grand narrative is not helping much in the day-to-day negotiation on the ground. So maybe around 12 years back, we started developing a much more localized, granular tool, which, for lack of a better word, we call political context analysis, by bringing very, very locally pertinent indicators to do a bit of a qualitative mapping on where the ground is shifting. And in fact, some of the most powerful PEA moments, if I can call them, didn't emerge from joint sense-making sessions that we had with our local partners and local government partners. So for us, this has been more of going granular at one level and having instruments which are sensitive enough to pick up that, including rumors and field whispers, which are very, very important than the formal data that you have on one side. Because the anecdotal, the orality of what goes in the ground is far more valuable as an indicator of political shift than the formal, aggregated, sanitized version you get on top. The second challenge has been to socialize PEA within the team, not as a product, but as how do you kind of use it and get a culture in that. And there was an interesting challenge in terms of the team composition, because if you treat PEA as a formal product, then you need people who have the vocabulary, the jargons, the semantics to write something. But what we actually need were people who were contextually grounded, who may not have the vocabulary, but who senses and intuition are sharp enough to give us the information, the valuable information that we need. So in some sense, as somebody said, it has been a balance of having people who know the word and people who knew the world. So this has been a challenge in how do you balance this two. And the second, the final element is when we begin to see this kind of exercises become a pedagogical tool for local actors. For example, the joint sense-making sessions we had with local politicians was in a way so empowering that for the first time, the PEA that we did priced open data silos, which were never open to political level, which were the captive of the bureaucracy to some extent. So the more participatory it becomes, the more empowering and more localized, to follow up on a point Duncan was making. So it's all about, in the end, building governance antennas which would pick up agile, useful information, which would help you to calibrate when to push back, when to accelerate. And that to us was much more powerful from a daily battle in the trenches, as opposed to this grand picture that comes out, which has its own utility in picking up the big signals. But for the micromanaged, the project type of programmatic work, the more localized, granular operations were far more powerful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I like that idea of governance antennas. I've written that down. Nicola, I wanted to come back to you then before we go to audience questions. We've discussed a lot that challenge of how you translate PEA into action, not only in terms of the sort of day-to-day thinking and working politically, but also at a strategic level in terms of actually driving program designs and those longer-term theories of change, that sort of bigger picture consequences perhaps of everyday PEA. So I wonder, how do you think we could improve that connection so that PEA becomes more readily actionable and driving that bigger picture stuff, particularly when people so regularly say, oh, we do PEA intuitively all the time, we don't need, all this process?
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, and I just want to really appreciate everyone's input so far. One of the things that I'm noting down to myself is just how well we're illustrating the complexity, not just the change in, as Duncan was saying, it's not the development context out there, but we've got here so many different interactions. We've got a changing aid world. We've got the interaction between development, foreign policy and trade, and how that interaction is evolving, and then how that interacts with the context in which we're working. And I think that's one of the things that also illustrates the complexity of what we're doing. So, in response to your question, and this is something that it's kind of this sort of weird, ironic counterpoint to this long-term, how do we do PEA better in the everyday, is this other version we get, which is, oh, we do it all the time. We're always doing PEA. We're out there. We do it intuitively. And I reckon this is kind of one of the possibly a key to how we could integrate it better into theory of change, in the sense that I think that idea that we do it intuitively often relates to a kind of reductionist idea of PEA, which is all about stakeholder analysis. That it's all about understanding power, influence, interests, how they're distributed across different groups and individuals, how the political settlement and the elite is configured. And this is all really important, and this is at the heart of the PEA that we're thinking about. But that's not all that a PEA is about. And I think that's really important. It misses the fact that PEA is not just about understanding stakeholders, but it is about understanding broader change processes and how change happens, how institutions evolve and the structures within which they sit. And sometimes that's over long periods of time. So yes, we might all be super politically savvy and understand the politics of the stakeholders immediately in front of us. But to me, the question is, have we stepped back to take the bigger picture view, the long view? Are we thinking about the broader political implications of our work, what we're legitimizing, what we might be undermining? What's the longer term goal of our efforts? As Gopa said, he started to really reframe the longer term goal. And this comes to Duncan's point too at the beginning about the kind of political economy. Is that really what we're doing? Because to do that, as we've found in developing the guidance that we've worked on together, Lisa, this requires, some grasp of history, the broader technological, social, economic and political trends. And an ability to link those to what's happening now. And it means really trying to understand and unpack how formal and informal institutions interact, because ultimately those are what's really sort of shaping behaviour. So the point about that is it's really not very easy. And that, to me, that's the hardest part of applying PEA, is to unlearn sort of the habits and mental models that we have that preclude that kind of thinking, to where we don't have necessarily the language or the ways of talking about the informal incentives. We rely on words like rent seeking, patronage, clientelism, but we don't have a very strong sort of repertoire of these ideas and terms. And so I think that going to that level and understanding that level, I think, in applying PEA thinking is the challenge, but also the opportunity of incorporating it into our theories of change. And I guess that's one of the main reasons that we developed that guidance and put it out, is because we wanted to make that a broad-based effort as much as possible as well. Back to you, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm just looking at the growing number of questions, which I won't be able to keep in my mind if we don't go to them quickly. I might do them in a couple of rounds, and I assume all the rest of you can see them, so please do jump in and have a look in the Q&A. There's a comment there from Catherine Bain, and Catherine, I was thinking of the same example in response to Duncan around the evidence for TWP approaches, and she mentions the approach used around land reform in the Philippines by TAF compared to the approaches that had been taken by the World Bank before that. So let me pick two questions from this list for a first round, and then we'll go again. So Duncan, there's a question for you here from Matt Clancy. If you want to get the economists out of here, do you want other perspectives in? I ask because I think PEA has become a mainstream trope for a lot of us now, but in daily practice, it translates into I'm a politics tragic and read the paper every day, which I don't think is sufficiently robust enough to help us navigate political dynamics that constrain development outcomes. So what else do we need in there? And I'll also go to Alan's question. Hang on, let me get it up. Which I think Nicola and Gopa, you guys might want to take on, but everyone's welcome. Do the panel have views on how different approaches and tools for PEA shape its application and usefulness for particular challenges and problems? We often have debates about the virtues and challenges of big macro PEA versus everyday, quick and agile PEA. So we might start with those. Duncan, can I come to you first?
I love that quote from Matt. I'm a politics tragic and I read the paper every day. That is my experience of a lot of PEA, which is like a form of intelligent regurgitation of the Economist and the FT, which is, I think, of limited value. So I would say on this, and maybe I disagree with some of the other speakers, that I think to make it more than intelligent regurgitation, I think we do need tools and frameworks. We need sort of heuristics, ways to push us to ask the right questions. And I've become a bit of a convert to this over the last few years at the LSE. I was initially a kind of hand-wavy systems person who didn't want to nail anything down ever. Now I'm actually chucking out fishbone diagrams and stakeholder maps, and people find them really useful. So I think there are tools which open the mind and sort of bring in the oxygen to the conversation, and there are tools which become checklists. And we need to distinguish between the two. So I think you need the tools and frameworks. I think I'll come back, I'm start record here, but you need the local insights, the stuff that is not in the papers, not in the Economist and the FT or the local papers, that people know if they've grown up somewhere and are often part of the elite or children of ministers or the kind of people that get employed in the aid sector. Those insights which are not in the papers, you need to bring those in. And then I think the other thing is, I had a great conversation with Wilf Mwamba in Zambia, who's a kind of a bit of a TWP guru for me. And he said, look, I make an actual point of having conversations every month with people who I disagree with to get out of the bubble. And so that's another way, just the personal conversations with people to try and increase your grasp of what the hell's going on there. So I think those things. One other insight I've had from the conversation so far, PEA, what constitutes good PEA depends on you, depends on your positionality, as we say. If you're a small NGO, I think it's probably not that much use thinking about shifting the big structures. You're trying to get small wins within the existing structure, and therefore you will think differently from if you're a donor with major impact, major influence, say Australia in one of the Pacific Islands, where you can actually think big picture and everything in between. So you need to think about what is the right level of PEA for you and your organization and the power you have in the system. You are part of this, and you need to adjust, dial up, dial down, think differently depending on where you are.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. Nicola and Gopa, did you want to take Alan's question? And then Kirsten, I've got a couple for you coming.
Gopa, I'm happy to. Do you want to?
You start, Nicola. Go for it.
I'll start. Okay, a good question, Alan. So Alan's asking, and I think people can't see the questions, and in case they can't, Alan's asking, do the panel have views on how different approaches and tools for PEA shape its application and usefulness for particular challenges and problems? We often have debates around the virtues, challenges of big macro PEA versus everyday, quick and agile PEA. And this is a really good question. I think in part, I'd also want to say that coming back to Gopa's point earlier too about the team and who does the PEA, that it's as much about the team and the people as it is about the types of analysis and when we do them. And then I think there's different places, even, depends on the level of the crisis, etc. But in a program cycle, which we all tend to use, there's value to different levels of analysis at different parts of it. So I think, making sure that at some regular points, you're coming back to that big macro PEA and those big macro questions as a team, but that may not be, not necessarily once a week. It could be once every, 6 months or 3 months. In our strategy testing process, we try to do that sort of every 3 months so that you come back to the big macro PEA questions. But a lot of the time you're then down in the weeds asking the day-to-day PEA questions around stakeholders. But it's that, and I think there's a balance to be struck between those two levels and making sure that everyone lifts their head above the podium a little bit every so often and has those questions and checks that, for strategy testing, checks we're all on track for the right outcomes. And I think that involves bringing in those bigger macro PEA questions. Gopa, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Just to flag a couple of additional points, I think it's very essential to have both, but the question is how do you position them, A, and B, what do you do with that analysis that you have? So if you look at the Sri Lankan case, the very fact that this 20-year program got embedded in a politically fragile, contested space came out of a PEA which looked at conflict and its strategic implications, and figured out that if you want to work in Sri Lanka on subnational governance, the narrative have to anchor around local economic development and not about decentralization or devolution, which are political pejoratives. So it gave a peg around which to position the program, which faced least political headwinds, and it could move this 20 years along that path. So it was extremely useful in positioning that. But like I said, for the nimbleness in actually implementing on the ground, you need a different set of agile instruments. You need that kind of an intelligence which is homegrown, which is contextually grounded. So I think it's a mix of the two. And we often use the macro PEA analysis and kind of drum it down for our local sense-making sessions. That is where it has an impact. For example, right now, the country is traversing through a post-IMF bailout session. So what is the implication for local councils when fiscal prudence and consolidation happens? So that's a macro message. But once you drum it down and bring it into simple visual cues, scenario building exercises for local councils, then that has a meaning and a relevance. So I just wanted to add to what Nicola said with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Gopa. All right, the questions are coming thick and fast. So, Kirsten, there's a couple for you, or I think are best answered by you. So we've got one here from Li Yang Lao, who asks about whether funders really need a lengthy PEA report to provide context and justifications, particularly given that they're often not, really granular and are often filled with jargon and so less relevant for on the ground use. And a second question for you from Paul Terry, and others might have ideas on this as well. Can you think of examples of aid investments that have had a contractual, operational or financial architecture that enabled the effective use of PEA within program implementation? And what was it that made it work? Nicola and Gopa, there might be some TAF examples as well where you think that's been set up well. And then maybe just to throw in two broader questions that anyone can take a stab at. One from Tom Davis. We seem to want development managers, donors and local, to be political economy analysts, pragmatic managers, technically savvy, financial and risk managers, excellent at HR, diplomatically capable, and so on and so on. Do these paragons actually exist? Does PEA actually push us to rethink what managers are and do, and even why they exist? And maybe one other I will throw in, which is around AI. And how AI might influence PEA. So do we think AI will make political economy analysis sharper or strip it of its soul and grounding? That's from Geordie Fung. And I must say that as a total as a total AI skeptic, not a PEA skeptic, I've been appalled at how good ChatGPT answers are on political economy and whether we'll all be out of a job. So Kirsten, I might come to you first and then whip around the rest of the panel. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lisa, and thanks for those questions. So in response to the question about do we really need these lengthy reports, I would kind of iterate and go back to some of the points that Gopa was just making. To me, the answer to that is, what are we intending to do with the analysis, and therefore what kind of analysis do we really need, and what kind of process do we really need in terms of applying what we're learning. So I think from my perspective, I think the answer is no, not necessarily. We need to be really careful about, as others have talked about today, what are we trying to influence, what are we trying to understand, and what's the purpose of doing this analysis? And so we need to be very pragmatic about that. Are we trying to influence a decision that's happening tomorrow? A meeting next week? A 5 to 10 year design documentation process? A strategy. So all of those kind of processes that, particularly from the perspective of sort of the lens of a government actor, we're thinking about what information do we need to kind of understand the context or the change that we're trying to influence, and through what process, and how quickly do we need to understand and inform a decision, or whatever it might be. So for example, when we were doing our development partnership plans, these are sort of under our current policy, our way of negotiating and articulating with our partners what it is that the Australian government will work together on with our partners. We in DFAT opted at that time, these are 5-year strategic documents, so we did support geographic areas to access and undertake a sort of point in time analytical product. It wasn't sort of a book, but sort of that was a kind of point in time moment where we did think that a kind of a base level of kind of broad based analysis of sort of how is developmental change shaping up in a particular country was useful. But then beyond that, though, it's then about day to day how we then use that base level knowledge and then update, tweak, inform, look for other test our assumptions when we're doing design processes, and then through to when we're delivering or undertaking cooperation on the ground. And just then to link through to their second question about, are there examples of where we as a department, as an organization, have been able to effectively or usefully make use or incentivize the use of political economy analysis. We have, within our guidance for in the development cooperation program, it's essentially a kind of a requirement that our teams, that these designs do need to be informed by evidence and analysis of that has informed the kind of the process or the approach that we're proposing to take. So we're trying to sort of institutionalize that within the way we think about, determining how to spend official development assistance. And so I think the other area that we see it coming through is around the demand on, because of the real world, we know we need to be flexible, and adaptive. And this is also a way of working that's not new. This has been dawning on all of us, over the last 20, 25 years. So I think in terms of where we see examples of interactions or cooperation that works, it's where we've been very clear and deliberate about building in and working in a way that is flexible, that can continually be changed and updated over time, and that there's processes for enabling that change to happen that are evidence-based, and in particular informed by an ongoing understanding of how change is happening and unfolding in a particular context.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. Nicola, can I go to you next?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to jump in on Geordie's question just because I've been sitting here pondering it, and I'm sure everybody wants to jump in on Geordie's question because it's the most fun. But I think, Geordie, I don't think AI will take over PEA analysis and put everyone out of a job immediately, largely because, and I think this is what we find with trying to analyze, trying to understand, sometimes document, not always document, but sometimes document and understand informal institutions. They're very culturally specific, they're very local, and quite often the researchers that we work with across different TAF offices are told there's no document review that you can do to understand these. You need to go and talk to people, and we'll help devise the questions that you're going to ask to talk to people and find out what those informal institutions are and how they operate. So that information at this point in time is very unlikely to be being fed into ChatGPT in any way that is relevant or useful or grounded in reality. So I think, some of the high level analyses, the ways that you can use ChatGPT for, your basic research, analysing bigger long-term trends, some of the historical analysis as it learns more and more and gets more into history, for example. But for that really core dimension of informal institutions, I can't imagine when it'll be that AI is that involved in that bit. I don't know what others think, because that was just fun to think about.
Thanks, Nicola. We live another day. Duncan?
Yeah, just bouncing off what Nicola just said. I think AI is going to be like, it gets you to first base straight away. And the first base is, what's published about this, synthesized really well. I'm a big fan of AI. I love using it. I know it's, I'm killing the planet and all the rest of it, but sorry. But in terms of the consultants on the call, I think you can kiss goodbye to the big bricks which no one reads. So the consultancy skills are going to be about facilitating those conversations and asking the right questions with people on the ground. So you're going to have a different kind of set of skills as a consultant, because the days when you could just sit in your office churning out the same report over and over again are going to be over. So I think that's quite an interesting challenge to the PEA industry, which it's very small, but it does exist. I also really liked Diana Fernandez's question about the fast and furious shifts, which just kind of whoosh. Sometimes they're like domino effects, and we're sitting there, doing our workshops and doing our strategy testing, and suddenly bam, something comes. And I've been doing a bit of thinking about, defensive advocacy versus front foot advocacy, and how is it different. And I think these kind of fast and furious shifts, you don't have much time, You got to think about who are the messengers that we're going to try and pull in to take a message to the government or whoever we're trying to influence and save a lot of time. Is it going to be former ministers? Is it going to be Bill Gates? Who's it going to be from the outside? And then you make a big noise quickly to try and prevent something happening. You don't have the time to construct a carefully designed influencing strategy or program, and it's not the most effective thing. So I think we do have to get better at these back foot ideas, because all our tools and thinking is based on making the world better rather than stopping it getting worse, and that's a big challenge, I think, in a lot of countries.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. And Gopar, over to you.
Can I also ride on the AI bandwagon? Because
we do have to answer other people's questions.
But it's not a response. I think the far more eloquent responses have come on that. But it sort of triggered a question that as governance become more AI mediated, when algorithmic governance is taking place, how do PEA keep pace with it? When the code becomes the site of politics, not just structures, what tools do we need to forge to really calibrate and evaluate what's happening in the digital governance field? I think that's a topic for another webinar, but I thought I'll just leave it here as a kind of a disquieting thought. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm conscious that the hour has gone, so we probably do need to start to draw to a close, but I would like to give just each of our panelists a final word takeaway, just 30 seconds on your final reflections. And perhaps Peter Evans has asked a question. Well, he's asked a couple of questions, but one is around what is the ambition for the next decade for PEA. So that might be something to hone your thoughts. So we might just go in reverse order. Gopar, can I come to you? Final thought.
I thought, given the current context, when aid retreats, what remains is trust, relationships, and habits. So to me, the question is, how do we kind of vitalize the craft of humility, empathy, and relational intelligence to make sure this aspects are illuminated, supported, and sustained? So that would be my takeaway from this.
Thank you. Duncan.
I suppose, shrinking aid is the context, with Australia a glorious exception. Thank you, Australia. But the rest of the world is plunged in gloom. So I guess what I would say there is that this is the moment when PEA needs to step up and show that it's actually more suited in terms of value for money, in terms of plugging into other parts of government, as Kirsten said, that PEA is a way of doing influencing better, that these things are better than the big technical programs which we no longer have money for. So I think PEA should be trying to position itself as part of the solution to how we keep doing good things in the current setting.
Thanks, Duncan. Nicola?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. Riffing in part off the questions that we didn't get to. So, as you say, Peter was asking what the ambition is for the next decade. I think some of that has to do with having this much more closely and explicitly interlinked political economy of the donor and the political economy of the international development architecture, and how that interacts with the context, and that being the subject of the PEA, not a slightly more colonial approach, which is the more, that we're looking at the context out there. I think that has to really be centralised and applied in order to align with locally led development, continue that sort of momentum going, and support that effort. And as we say in the, not throw the baby out with the bathwater of international development thinking. And the other thing I think, which speaks to Tom's question about who's doing PEA and how many efforts and skills we expect everybody to have, I think, we need to broaden out the idea of who does the PEA. That it's beyond donors and INGOs, it's local partners, it's civil society, local authorities. We've had some really great responses to doing PEA workshops and analyses together with our civil society partners in various countries. And I think that's where we should go with it. It's not us doing the PEA, it's actually local partners, local organisations, local authorities, finding it a useful conceptual framework and applying it to their own work. And that's where that would be one of my ambitions for where we take it in TAF.
Yeah, great point. Thanks, Nicola. And Kirsten.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thanks everyone. I think, and I'll be riffing off what everyone has said, I think in terms of where to next, we really need to think about how we use this kind of capability in these processes to understand how change happens beyond aid, beyond ODA, and beyond even sort of notions of sort of the development sector. We need to just think about this and think about how we can make this tool useful in a much broader framing around supporting change processes. And then to put Nicola's point, and also Gopa made this point earlier, if we go back to this idea of, if we're committed to supporting locally led change processes, as particularly as external actors, we need to make sure we're including ourselves, the external actors, in understanding what is shaping the political economy of a change process in a particular context. And also thinking about, as both Nicola and Gopa and probably Duncan have said as well, how can these tools be useful for everyone, external actors as well as local actors, who are we're all trying to understand how things are operating and how we can influence it from different perspectives. And this, I think, is particularly important in terms of the context of complexity. Locally led, change processes locally are, as we know, influenced by regional, global, dynamics. So it's a big complex stew. So the more we can then think laterally and creatively about making these tools useful for actors of all kinds to understand themselves, one another, and how change is happening, I think that would be really useful. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a lot more to be explored, and particularly around, Duncan, I like to phrase you used at the beginning around how PEA can lose that outsider mentality and adopt much more sort of locally relevant methods. And I also note and share the sentiment from an anonymous question that was there, that there seems to be shrinking space to play a critical friend role to donors, particularly where their interests are increasingly driven by non-developmental interests. So I think there's much more that we could discuss and unpack here. Apologies that we haven't got to answer all of the questions in the Q&A function. Please feel free to reach out to the speakers with any direct follow-ups if you would like. As Nicola mentioned, TAF have published an accessible PEA guidance note with the intention of providing programs and teams with these sorts of handy tools and activities to undertake PEA collectively. And I think there's a link to that in the chat. Thank you very much to our speakers, Kirsten, Duncan, Gopa and Nicola, for sharing your expertise. And thank you to all of you for joining in your respective time zones and for your interest in PEA. It's great to see that there's such a strong appetite for these discussions. Have a lovely rest of your day or evening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.